Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered but brought back to life with depth and clarity. In 37 AD, Rome crowned a god who prayed only to himself. His name was Caligula, a man who believed cruelty was the purest form of truth. Beneath marble ceilings and golden laurel wreaths, mercy became theatre and agony became art. He would kiss a woman's hand before destroying her family's smile at a senator while condemning his bloodline. Rome thought it had found salvation. It had created a predator in the shape of a savior. If you value the historical records, subscribe. When the ledgers close, the bones still speak. He was born into the empire's bloodstream, son of Germanicus, the beloved general who had embodied Rome's virtue. Soldiers adored the boy who played among them in miniature armor, calling him Caligula Little Boots. From birth, he was trained to see power not as duty but as spectacle. When Tiberius died, the empire erupted with joy. At last, a god of kindness had come to restore the old world. The Senate opened the prisons. The crowds threw petals. For the first time in years, people dared to hope. Caligula's kindness was the first act of his cruelty, a test to see how easily love could become obedience. He rewarded the loyal, then humiliated them in public. He elevated nobles, then stripped them bare before their peers. He turned intimacy into theatre and faith into a trap. He did not just kill, he made death wait. He made for lust. Soon the city realized the pattern. Every gift was poisoned, every embrace a performance. He would smile as men begged for mercy, pause just long enough for gratitude, and then order the blade. His genius was not madness, it was precision. He understood what Rome itself had forgotten, that an empire built on conquest needs cruelty to feel alive. At first, Rome called it rumor, just another emperor's indulgence exaggerated by jealous senators. But rumors in Caligula's Rome were not exaggerations, they were advanced warnings. The Senate had always been the theatre of Rome's dignity, marble floors echoing with oratory, the air thick with legal precision. Yet under Caligula it became a different kind of stage, a place where silence was the only safe language. The emperor began summoning senators and their wives to the palace for consultations. These sessions often ended not in decrees but in humiliation. Wives trembling were paraded before the ruler who now claimed divine rights over all mortal unions. The Senate's legal debates on marriage and morality were mocked in the most literal way possible by being physically inverted. Caligula would interrupt discussions on inheritance laws with jokes about whose wife was most beautiful or most obedient. The laughter that followed was forced mechanical, a sound manufactured under threat. For those who didn't laugh, the punishment was ruin, confiscation of property, exile, or disappearance. Rome's most powerful men discovered that law itself could be violated from the inside out, turned into a performance that mocked its own solemnity. In one recorded incident, he ordered the marriage of his loyal officer's wife, Ennia, to be annulled so that he himself could marry her for a night. When the officer protested, Caligula reminded him that imperial desire was a decree stronger than any Senate edict. It was not lust, it was law. This was the chilling innovation of his reign, the fusion of legality and desire. What had once been the empire's proudest invention, the codified law became the emperor's instrument of private gratification. Every forced union, every seized wife, every public insult was justified under the same principle that built Rome's greatness. The will of the sovereign was itself the law. Ancient sources describe his taunting tone during these humiliations. He would emerge from behind curtains at banquets mocking noblemen about their wives' performance. The laughter he demanded was more terrifying than any sword because it was an oath of submission. Rome's men bowed deeper with each insult, proving that obedience was the only remaining virtue. The philosopher Seneca, who lived through this era, later wrote that tyranny begins where shame becomes entertainment. Caligula understood this perfectly. He weaponized shame, transforming the Senate from a council of rulers into a chorus of spectators. The men who once wrote laws now performed obedience in his theater of domination. In doing so, he discovered a profound political truth: to rule Rome One must not only command its bodies, but also its definitions. If the emperor could redefine a marriage, redefine decency, redefine justice itself, then every act of cruelty became legally sanctified. The result was a new kind of governance, one that did not need armies to enforce compliance. It relied on humiliation. Every senator who endured his wife's violation in silence became part of the system's self-perpetuation. To resist was treason. To suffer quietly was proof of loyalty. Behind the spectacle of sexual excess lay a terrifying bureaucracy. Imperial scribes recorded the gifts and favors of women taken from noble houses, classifying them like property transfers. A wife could vanish into the palace one night and return legally diminished the next. The documents of empire reflected not the chaos of madness, but the precision of accounting. Even religion bent beneath this perversion of law. When Caligula declared himself the living Jupiter, divine marriage itself became his legal domain. He claimed the right to bless or desecrate any union under heaven. In the emperor's mind, Jupiter had many consorts. So too would he. His decrees on sacred chastity were written in the same ink as his private invitations. The line between divine authority and personal lust dissolved completely. For the people of Rome, this was not merely scandal, it was revelation. They saw that the empire's entire hierarchy, built on law and ritual, could be turned against them with a single command. Every system, marriage, property, religion, proved fragile once the ruler's desire entered the equation. Yet, there was something even darker beneath the political mechanics. Caligula's actions were not random cruelty, they were experiment tests to see how far Rome's conscience could bend before breaking. Each public violation was a question posed to the collective morality of the empire. Will you still obey? Will you still believe in the sanctity of law when the law itself become obscene? And Rome answered yes. Through silence, through applause, through taxes paid and temples maintained, the empire validated the system that desecrated it. When the Senate assembled, every man knew what had happened in the palace the night before. They signed decrees, adjusted budgets, and delivered speeches about divine favor. The machinery of state turned smoothly, lubricated by fear. The Republic's corpse still moved, but only because humiliation had become the new form of governance. Caligula had proven something eternal, that domination need not rely on visible violence. When the law itself is corrupted, the body becomes its own prison. The marble pillars still gleamed, the city still prayed, but Rome's heartbeat had changed rhythm. Beneath the robes and rhetoric, every senator carried the knowledge that the next decree might strip him not only of power, but of dignity itself. If the law could be rewritten by desire, what would happen when desire demanded the sacred itself? By the second year of high reign, the lines between Caligula's private chambers and the administration of Rome had vanished. The palace was no longer a seat of government. It was a marketplace of flesh. Senators who once debated taxes now paid them in humiliation. Nobles arrived in ceremonial togas and left stripped of dignity, their wives and daughters renamed, catalogued, and priced like merchandise. The ancient chroniclers wrote of these events with trembling restraint. They called it Caligula's house of state. To the emperor it was efficiency, to the empire it was revelation. He had realized that the body could serve as both currency and message. What gold could not buy, loyalty, fear, reverence, humiliation could. So he turned the palace into a brothel, not of secrecy, but of symbolism. Rooms once used for imperial councils became perfumed chambers. Marble corridors echoed not with footsteps of envoys, but with muffled sobs. Invitations were issued not as threats, but as duties. Wives of senators, noble matrons, even priestesses were ordered to serve guests in war of the divine Caesar. And they came because refusal meant treason. Coins clinked on polished marble as men of Rome, soldiers, merchants, even ambassadors were instructed to pay for entry. The money went to imperial coffers. Caligula's agents recorded every transaction, turning degradation into accounting. The empire's treasury, drained by endless games and monuments, found new liquidity through forced vice. It was taxation by body, an innovation Rome had never dared imagine. The emperor's motives, though wrapped in madness, carried a cold logic. By erasing the boundary between public and private, he dismantled the last defense of Roman morality. There could be no virtue left to oppose him once every virtue had been sold under his roof. The symbolism was deliberate. Every man who entered the palace to pay for pleasure knew that he as also paying tribute. Every woman who served knew that her body was now part of the state's revenue. The humiliation was collective. Rome itself was being prostituted. Ancient sources describe senators watching their wives serve strangers, while the emperor stood laughing, tossing coins like blessings. When one nobleman wept openly, Caligula is said to have told him, "Why grieve, senator? You should thank me. Your household now serves Rome. It was not lust, it was governance." The brothel was bureaucracy, the bed a throne. He even issued tokens bearing his image, small bronze discs used for admission to the house of Jupiter. Archaeologists later found similar objects near Palatine Hill, marked with inscriptions suggesting regulated access. Each carried the emperor's profile, his smirk immortalized beside the word divas, the divine. It was as if Rome's gods now stamped consent onto every act of defilement. Witnesses say that during these nights Caligula would walk the corridors in disguise, a hooded spectator to his own spectacle. He would pause at doorways, watching senators kneel, not in debate but in submission, whispering prayers that were indistinguishable from moans. He wanted to see if power could survive its own degradation. And it did, because even this system worked. The treasury refilled, taxes flowed, foreign ambassadors arrived with gifts unwilling to offend a god. Rome's machinery of empire still turned, powered by the same citizens it humiliated. The moral structure of the city cracked quietly like marble under stress. The line between sacred and obscene dissolved so completely that even priests began to justify it as divine theatre. If the emperor is God, one wrote, then his acts are beyond sin. And that was the perfection of Caligula's plan. By collapsing shame into ritual, he made vice untouchable. His crimes became liturgy, the empire's worship of Ortho. Riti became indistinguishable from its appetite for humiliation. In the morning, when the candles burned down and the perfumed air thickened with despair, scribes returned to their desks. They stamped seals, calculated revenues, drafted new decrees. The machinery of empire resumed unbroken. The night's screams were filed under income. By then, no one could tell where the body ended and the state began. Caligula had fused the two into a single organism. The empire itself became his flesh, its veins his pleasure, its gold his desire. Every Roman who entered the palace participated in the act, some as buyers, some as victims, all as witnesses. The Senate debated once more about taxation and morality, pretending the stench of the night before did not linger on their robes. Yet deep down, each man knew the brothel had become the blueprint. The empire had discovered a new resource: humiliation as economy. The question was no longer how it began, but who would dare end it. If the palace could be turned into a market, what would happen when the temples followed? The Roman world measured everything grain-oil distance. Even blood spilled in the arena. But under Caligula, a new unit of value appeared: the body. Every body in Rome had a price. Not only slaves whose names were already inked into ledgers, but wives of senators, daughters of generals and priestesses once protected by vows. Each was categorized, recorded and taxed according to their service. The palace had accountants, not pimps; contracts, not whispers. Shame had become an entry in the imperial budget. The mechanism was astonishingly methodical. Caligula's fiscal reforms, once hailed as creative, had a second purpose: to transform desire into revenue. He revived the old crown tax, a fee paid to the emperor on special occasions, and expanded it to include gifts of pleasure. Senators were required to offer women from heir households as part of this tribute. The imperial treasurers dutifully logged each offering, assigning market values as if cataloguing horses or amphorae of wine. It was the perfect synthesis of Roman efficiency and depravity. Sex became a fiscal instrument, humiliation an administrative category. Historians later called it moral collapse, but within the logic of empire, it was merely another form of extraction. From Egypt came grain, from Spain silver, from the bodies of Rome loyalty. In the archives, fragments of papyrus survive listing payments from provinces for divine celebration. Some scholars suspect these were euphemisms for human tributes young women sent as tokens of devotion to the living God. Each transaction bled into the next until the line between taxation and sacrifice vanished. Even slaves, once the lowest stratum of the Roman economy, were reorganized. Those deemed attractive were removed from labor rosters and reassigned to the palace service corps, officially designated ornaments. Their upkeep was charged to the state treasury, their use recorded as imperial entertainment. The transformation was complete from human property to state assets of pleasure. Caligula had discovered a truth. Rome had long denied that empire was at its core a machine for turning bodies into value. He merely stripped away the pretense. What others hid in rhetoric, he paraded as law. To sustain this machinery, he needed legitimacy, so he wove desire into divine justification. The emperor, he proclaimed, was Jupiter's incarnation, and thus every act of his will, sexual, financial, or violent, was cosmic balance. When he took a senator's wife, it was not adultery, it was taxation in flesh. When he imposed a levy on temple prostitutes, it was not corruption, it was tribute to the gods through him. And the empire obeyed because disobedience now meant blasphemy at the heart of I. All stood the imperial treasury, the fiscus. Its clerks, trained in mathematics and morality alike, recorded the profits from what were delicately labeled donations to the divine person. The figures were staggering. Some provinces doubled their payments in fear of appearing impious. Senators borrowed money to fund Caligula's spectacles of lust, knowing that financial ruin was safer than refusal. A strange inversion had occurred. Rome, once proud of its law and virtue, now found strength in its degradation. The emperor's appetite was limitless, but it kept the economy moving. Taverns, perfumers, linen merchants, and jewelers all thrived on the commerce of shame. Even moralists grew rich writing treatises condemning the very corruption that fed them. The people whispered but paid. The priests blushed but blessed. The scribes hesitated then signed. Complicity became the foundation of stability. Through it all, Caligula watched with clinical fascination. He did not simply desire. He audited desire. Each conquest, each humiliation, each coerced act was data in his living experiment, the testing of Rome's moral elasticity. How much could an empire built on discipline endure before it collapsed into indulgence? His conclusion was brutal. There was no limit. The economy absorbed everything, even its own desecration. As long as taxes were paid and grain arrived from Egypt, no one dared interrupt the emperor's ledger. The empire's heart kept beating, pumping coins instead of blood. And yet, in the shadows of the treasury, something shifted among the clerks and secretaries who processed the donations. Guilt began to ferment. They could calculate the profit of degradation, but not its cost to the soul. A few started leaving lines blank in the record, silent rebellions that no one dared speak of. Outside, the city glistened as always. Gladiators fought, poets recited, temples smoked with incense, but the scent of the empire had changed. Underneath the myrrh and olive oil lingered something metallic, intimate, the odor of a civilization monetizing its own shame. Caligula had turned desire into law into ledger, and ledger into scripture. The empire's faith was no longer in justice or virtue, but in the profitability of obedience. When an empire learns to profit from desecration, what happens when the gods themselves become commodities? The Roman Empire prided itself on law, the invisible architecture that held the world together. Every contract, every treaty, every execution was written into eternity. But under Caligula, the law ceased to be text. It became theater. The Senate chamber, once the sanctum of discipline, turned into a stage where obedience performed itself. Statues of ancestors looked down as if witnessing blasphemy, yet their marble silence became the perfect audience. Caligula presided not as emperor, but as director, rewriting decrees in the language of humiliation. Each edict began as law ended, as lust. The ritual was chillingly consistent. A decree would be announced, perhaps about inheritance or the regulation of dowries, and then interrupted. The emperor would summon the wife or daughter of a senator, forcing the assembly to watch as legality dissolved into mockery. What began as administrative formality turned into public desecration. Rome's greatest institution became his script. One evening, according to Cassius Dio, Caligula summoned a widow who had petitioned the Senate over her late husband's estate. As senators rose in solemn debate, he beckoned her forward, praised her devotion, and kissed her mouth before all. When she froze, he laughed, declaring, "Her claim is approved." The chamber erupted in forced applause. The case was closed. Justice had become spectacle, and shame its seal. Each new session blurred the line between decree and performance. Caligula once staged a mock trial where the accused was guilt itself. He appointed priests and senators as jurors, then called them one by one to stand and confess imaginary sins. Those who refused were charged with impiety. Those who obeyed were rewarded with the emperor's cruel smile. The verdict was always the same. The law served only one god himself. The Senate, stripped of meaning, learned the grammar of survival. To bow was safer than to argue. They adjusted their robes, feigned laughter, and signed decrees they no longer understood. Each signature became a confession that Rome's logic, the belief that virtue could be legislated, had collapsed. And yet the records continued. Scrolls were sealed, dates inscribed, wax stamps pressed. The bureaucratic rhythm of empire persisted, as if paperwork could contain madness. But every document was a lie, an official record of obedience dressed as reason. Caligula knew exactly what he was doing. His perversions were not accidents. They were pedagogy. He was teaching Rome the new meaning of law, that the emperor's desire was the constitution. To make that truth unforgettable, he turned legal process into performance art. Trials were held in banquet halls, witnesses summoned between courses. The accused were forced to serve their own judges wine. Those who pleaded innocence had to do so while kneeling at the emperor's feet. The ceremony blurred into cruelty, cruelty blurred into spectacle, and spectacle blurred into governance. Seneca, still young then, watched in horror. Years later, he would write that tyranny's greatest invention was to disguise punishment as entertainment. But in Caligula's reign, the disguise was gone. Rome watched itself laughing. When the law became theatre, the crowd became complicit. Citizens began attending trials for pleasure, gossiping about the latest performances. The emperor's humor infected the public. The moral rot was no longer confined to the palace. It had entered the bloodstream of Rome. The Senate mocked itself and the people cheered. There were moments when even the marble seemed to protest. Senators whispered that the gods would strike him down, but none dared move, because to oppose the performance was to admit the show was real, and to admit that meant death. Caligula's genius was to understand the psychology of domination. Violence terrifies, humiliation converts. A corpse can't obey, but a shamed man will obey forever. He didn't need to rewrite Rome's laws. He simply performed them until meaning collapsed. He called it reform. He claimed to cleanse corruption by exposing it. In truth, he only stripped away illusion. The empire that prided itself on justice discovered that its laws were as fragile as its gods, sustained only by the fear of seeing them broken. By the third year of his reign, decrees were no longer legal documents, but imperial monologues. Senators gathered not to legislate, but to witness. Rome's greatest invention, the rule of law, had become its most obscene ritual. And still the records continued to pile up. Edicts, charters, oaths, all signed under the same divine formula as the emperor wills. When the archives are read today, historians find no laws of Caligula that make sense, only performances, only props, the ink of governance mixed with the sweat of shame. Because the empire's law had learned a fatal lesson. The more it degraded itself, the more it proved his divinity. The senators left the chamber in silence, each carrying a copy of the decree he'd witnessed defiled. Rome continued to function. Taxes were collected, trials were scheduled, the illusion of civilization endured. But beneath the marble order, justice had become theatre and theatre empire. If law could become performance, what would? happen when the temple itself became the stage? The gods of Rome had always been practical. They protected the harvest, blessed the armies, punished the faithless. Religion was not mystery, it was contract, but under Caligula, that sacred contract was torn apart and rewritten in his own blood. When he declared himself Jupiter made flesh, Rome's temples trembled not from earthquake, but from uncertainty. Priests who had once mediated between mortals and the divine now stood before a living God who demanded not prayer but surrender. The rituals continued, but their meaning inverted. Offerings once meant for heaven were redirected to the palace. Sacrifice became spectacle. Worship became fear. The Vestal Virgins, guardians of Rome's eternal flame women, sworn to 30 years of chastity, were his first targets. Their purity had long symbolized the moral strength of the Republic, the unbroken lineage between Rome and its gods. To violate them was to violate the soul of the city. So he did. Ancient chronicles describe one night when Caligula stormed the temple of Vesta with torches blazing, priests scattering in confusion. He ordered the virgins assembled, examined them as if inspecting livestock, and dragged two into the darkness. The following morning, the temple doors opened to silence. The sacred flame still burned, but something unseen had gone out. The city pretended not to notice. The Senate offered prayers for divine harmony. Poets wrote hymns to Jupiter's human form. The priests themselves argued that perhaps the emperor's touch had sanctified, not defiled. Theology bent under fear. The logic was grotesque, yet convenient. If the god desired, then desire was holy. Caligula understood the power of this inversion. By desecrating the sacred, he didn't merely insult the gods, he colonized them. Every shrine, every altar, every priest became an extension of his will. He ordered his statue installed in the Temple of Jerusalem, demanding worship from a people who recognized no god but their own. The command sparked outrage across the East. Delegations begged him to reconsider, invoking prophecy and reason. He only laughed. "If they will not bow to me," he said, "then I will place myself among them." To him, divine resistance was proof of his divinity. Rome's priests whispered of omens. Comets, eclipses, and dying animals filled the city with dread. Yet the emperor seemed energized by their fear. He began holding nocturnal ceremonies where wine mixed with blood and acolytes forced or willing chanted hymns that blurred the line between praise and moan. In these ceremonies, he enacted a theology of domination that the gods themselves had surrendered their power to him. When he dressed as Mercury, he declared trit sacred to his desire. As Mars, he consecrated war to lust. As Venus, he blurred gender itself, appearing in gold-stitched robes and demanding to be adored for his beauty. Every costume was a decree, every decree a blasphemy. But the horror lay not only in the acts, it lay in the response. The priests obeyed. The Senate sent congratulations. Rome's most disciplined bureaucracy began documenting miracles that never happened, divine visions that no one saw. The lie became institutional. This was not madness, it was strategy. By desecrating what was holy, Caligula proved that no power existed above his own. The Republic's gods were now props, their altars annexed into imperial property. The temple tithe was redirected to fund his games and divine entertainments. When questioned, the treasury scribes replied that the emperor's pleasure was the purest form of worship. Through this corruption, he stumbled upon a principle older than empire, that religion stripped of reverence becomes the most efficient form of control. People will die for fire, but they will also endure anything done in its name. Caligula fused politics with ritual until both became indistinguishable. To obey the state was to worship the emperor. To worship the emperor was to ag the desecration of all else. In this union of divinity and power, Rome itself became a temple whose altar was humiliation. Citizens lined the streets during his processions, forced to kneel as he passed, dressed as Jupiter, the thunderbolt in hand. When lightning struck near the palace one afternoon, he claimed it was Jupiter saluting his reflection. The Senate decreed it a sign of divine favor. The flame of Vesta still burned, but no longer for Rome. It burned for him. And in that single transformation, the empire crossed an invisible line. The gods no longer judged the emperor judged the gods. If even divinity could be conquered, what remained untouched? Perhaps the invisible class who carried out his orders, the unseen machinery of obedience itself. Every empire hides its truth. Below the marble, beneath Caligula's golden ceilings, beneath the laughter of senators and the hymns to his godhood, lay a world without names, the machinery that made the spectacle run. They were the cooks, the torch-bearers, the cleaners of marble floors slick with wine and blood. They were the slaves. Their hands prepared the banquets of blasphemy. Their eyes saw what Rome could not afford to remember. Historians rarely mention them. Yet they were the empire's nervous system, the invisible body of Rome. When Caligula's appetites expanded beyond the limits of reason, it was they who ensured the performances continued. They built the stages dressed, the victims scrubbed the stains. The empire's purity, its illusion of control, depended on their silence. In the kitchens of the Palatine Hill, slaves moved like ghosts. At night, when the emperor's desires grew restless, a messenger would appear at the servants' quarters. A girl would be chosen, her name recorded once in a ledger, then erased. She would be led through corridors lined with torches and disappear into the emperor's chamber. By morning, the records would call it service, rendered to the divine household. To the administrators, it was data. To her, it was the end of personhood. Some were born into slavery, others sold by desperate families to pay debts or taxes. The empire called it commerce, Caligula called it providence. His mother's slaves, his father's soldiers, the children of conquered Gaul, all became part of a system that converted human breath into imperial order. What separated this from previous emperors was not the existence of cruelty, but its bureaucratization. Caligula turned degradation into policy. He instituted a palace registry for attendants of divine pleasure, assigning them numbers, ranks, and duties. Some were given perfumes, some trained in silence, others selected for pain. Each role was codified, each suffering indexed. A surviving fragment of Suetonius notes that Caligula's corridors were lined with guards who pretended not to see. To witness was to share guilt, to speak was to vanish. Silence was the first currency of empire. But silence is not emptiness. It remembers. Archaeologists have found scratched marks on tiles from the Palatine substructures, crude initials, prayers in vulgar Latin, half-erased names of mothers, traces of people erased from history, but unable to erase themselves. In this underworld of service, fear was routine, but complicity was the rule. Some slaves learned to anticipate commands before they were spoken to, smile at cruelty, to applaud humiliation. In that adaptation lay the empire's secret genius. Its victims sustained it. Rome's grandeur depended not on consent, but on self-preservation through obedience, the same logic. Extended beyond the palace. Builders who erected temples to Caligula's divinity were often slaves themselves, crafting the altars that justified their bondage. Fishermen hauled delicacies from distant shores for feasts they could never attend. The empire consumed them invisibly, turning muscle into ritual. The moral cost was shared. Guards who escorted trembling captives to the emperor's rooms hardened their hearts one order at a time. The scribes who logged the confiscations and deaths trained their hands to move without conscience. Bureaucracy became moral anesthesia. When later generations asked how could it happen, the answer was written in their survival. Each believed silence was safer than truth. And yet beneath that silence, resentment grew. The slaves heard the screams. The guards smelled the iron. The clerks read the edicts dripping with double meanings. They knew that power's mask of divinity was cracking, that even gods bled. Some began whispering in the corridors' murmurs that one day the emperor would face the same fate as those he broke. For now, though they endured, endurance was their rebellion, the only weapon left to the powerless. If Caligula's Rome was a body, its nerves were the enslaved. Every lash, every command, every whispered order traveled through them. Without their hands, his rituals would falter. Without their silence, his divinity would collapse. But power built on silence is always temporary because the more it demands invisibility, the more ghosts it creates, and ghosts never stay quiet. If the unseen body sustained the empire, what force sustained their silence? What turned fear itself into the empire's most reliable infrastructure? Every empire runs on logistics, grain, gold, soldiers, roads. Caligula's Rome added one more fear. It was not chaos, but a carefully engineered system, a bureaucracy of dread that reached every household. From the palace to the slums, fear had departments, it had clerks, it had a calendar. At the top stood the Taurian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor, but reprogrammed to protect his moods. Their armor glittered like divine sanction. Each morning they received sealed orders, some to escort prisoners, some to invite senators to the palace, others to deliver anonymous gifts that carried invisible threats. The Guard became the courier service of terror, ensuring that every Roman woke under the emperor's gaze. Within months, rumor itself had become an administrative tool. The streets of Rome hummed with stories of who had offended the divine Caesar, whose name had vanished from records, whose estate had been reassigned. No one knew what was true, which made it perfect. When fear is systemic, it doesn't need accuracy, it needs repetition. Caligula mastered this psychology. He would summon senators at midnight for consultations, let them wait in silence for hours, then dismiss them without a word. The uncertainty was exquisite punishment. Without crime, mercy, without reason, even the act of being ignored became political theater. In the Senate, silence acquired new grammar. A pause meant danger, laughter meant survival. Men spoke in riddles to avoid contradiction. Each word carried the weight of its possible misinterpretation. Rome, the civilization that built itself on eloquence, had entered an age where the highest virtue was muteness. The emperor didn't simply demand obedience. He measured it. He watched how men knelt, how long they bowed, how quickly they agreed. His court scribes recorded everything, gestures, hesitations, tremors. Fear became quantifiable, an index of loyalty. He often walked among the guards at night disguised, listening to whispers. Those who spoke too freely were executed. Those who stayed silent were rewarded. The lesson spread like a contagion. Apathy belonged to those who erased themselves. The people learned quickly. A merchant accused of mocking the emperor's new temple smashed his own goods in the forum to prove devotion. A poet burned his manuscripts before anyone could accuse him of satire. Mothers taught their children never to speak the emperor's name unless praising it. Terror became a civic virtue, but there was precision to this cruelty. Caligula understood that total oppression exhausts itself. To preserve the system, fear had to oscillate, moments of horror followed by false calm. He would stage sudden acts of generosity, pardoning prisoners, scattering gold to crowds weeping in public over Rome's sufferings. The city would breathe again, only to choke when the next execution came. Hope became part of the control loop. Even the Taurians lived in terror. They were both enforcers and hostages. Any delay, any gesture mistaken for contempt could turn them from instruments to victims. Some guarded his chambers, knowing that tomorrow they might be executed for guarding him too well. In that climate, the empire learned the purest form of discipline, self-censorship as survival.